Thank you, Michelle. And I've always felt the reason you joined me in 301 as secretary is because that guy talked you into it.
Something like that.
I do want to, we need to recognize Michael Fauble. That's the spark plug that started the Ken Hover recognition. And thank you, Michael. Thank you. And we all recognize Ken and his contribution to the concrete industry, to ACI, and to individual members of our organization. I wouldn't be here at ACI if it weren't for Ken Hover. And there's a bunch of, as we go through the timeline, there's a bunch of opportunities that came up, and we'll clarify the jail time issue that's coming up here in a minute. As we think about Ken Hover and what he has generated for our industry, it is a mountain of documentation, research, presentations, teaching. Ken taught at my former employer, taught to superintendents and foremen on concrete material science, and was fully engaged, so that even the finisher foremen were starting to pay attention. They didn't stop blessing this lab, but they knew it was wrong. But this is a picture of Mount Everest, and it's to simulate that we know what Ken has done. It's a mountain of work for our organization. I thought maybe even it could be a pyramid. That was fairly, but that's a masonry structure. It's unreinforced. Ken, and he's not 5,000 years old. Ken wouldn't have had anything to do with that structure, but maybe Ken would have been involved, in reincarnation. He could have been the architect, the engineer for this structure, but it's also, it wouldn't be much of a challenge. It's not reinforced, but maybe that was part of the challenge in this poured in place structure. Formwork system would have been pretty neat. But as we talk about 10, there's no prompt on that one. We've seen today that people have this Superman suit with Ken's picture on top of it, and I really don't think that's the proper attire for Ken Hover. Yeah, he's a Superman, but we all know that. But what he wears is maybe 3 different colors of this style of sweater. This one is a new picture. It's not 20. That sweater's not 20 years old. But that, and if you saw on Cecil's picture, Ken was in a sweater. And how do we describe Ken Hover? If we were to introduce Ken Hover, how would we do that? And I thought about that, and I came up with this. He's a person of, I like the adjective, great kindness, reliability, honest. And this definition is actually the definition for somebody that's the salt of the earth. And that describes Ken. Ken would certainly enjoy, as Michelle stated, to go eat the Italian restaurant with the white tablecloth and the extra fork and spoon at the top. But he'd rather prefer to go have a hamburger with what kind of cheese? Yeah. We also need to recognize that Ken's a Christ-centered man. And he's got we learned today that he's got some hobbies as it relates to the Civil War, but he's also got some other hobbies on Sundays, on Sunday mornings, as he's a traveling pastor in the Methodist church system there in New York. There's going to be a bunch of unchurched people if they ever move out of town. So, but I'm sure he'll start teaching throughout the Midwest soon. We've learned today about Ken's experience. We learned from Mike Ken's scouting experience, but if you notice, even at that age, the overachiever already had his Eagle badge, his God and Country Award, the example on teaching his younger brother Tom on how to make an omelet was excellent, but it showed that Ken encourages people in a positive manner. We heard about his college and his early career. For that short time he was a contractor. What Mike brought to us some of his brother's information, but I actually have a back door to some of that brother information. I would have, about 1967, we know what that concrete was at, maybe some of the younger folks don't, but it was rocks, sand, and cement and water. It was just four things. There wasn't admixtures or all that special, and keeping the water out was primary to keeping good concrete. But his brother was the concrete pumper, and I would have loved to seen that quality control man keeping the water out and the brother wanting more water in as they were pumping pressures getting too high. We could have had some brother fisticuffs there. And then, of course, Ken's military service and his family. And we see here this gal in a red jacket today, but Ken would not be the man he is if it wasn't for Debbie. We all know that. His daughters, Debbie's always supported him into ACI. And for example, when he was president, we saw a lot of Debbie. We did. So that was thank you for your service. I mentioned Ken's church. Ken is a substitute pastor in the Methodist Church organization, and you can catch some of his sermons. We know how detailed Ken is, and I'm assuming that down in the basement of the house there in Ithaca, there's scrolls, and it's the Book of John, the original Book of John in Greek, and Ken's got it, and he goes back to that level of detail. We'll see the detail he goes to in a few minutes. He's always been a teacher. He's always that professor, whether he's talking to an ironworker foreman or to the CEO of an organization. And we heard repeatedly that he is the mentor to people in this room, but people in our organizations, his students at Cornell. I was aware at one time early in my life of meeting Ken that a fraternity at Cornell got in trouble, and they were going to get kicked off campus. In order to mitigate that, they solicited Dr. Hover to be one of their sponsors and to get them out of hot water so that they didn't get disbanded. I never did hear how that turned out, whether or not they were successful. But let's recognize Ken's service to ACI, which also leads us to his service to the concrete industry. We've all got how I met Ken stories. And I wouldn't be here today but if it weren't for Ken. But the story starts of Ken and Jim in the late 80s. The company I worked for, we constructed a 14-story poured-in-place garage that had a mile of cracks on every floor. And we were in big trouble, $120 million worth, real money. And we hired a bunch of experts. The lawyer hired experts like John Breen out of UT Austin, and Dave Fowler out of UT Austin, Ramon Karaski out of Austin. You know, as a Texas Aggie, I was getting kind of tired of that. And I said, we got to find us a real college professor, not these guys from that small college on the Colorado. So they found this guy. Well, he's from one of those Ivy League schools, and one of those Yankee schools even, and questionable. And so I got to know this guy and this group, and as I was the company rep in those 9 months, I got a PhD level education on concrete material science and parking garage design. And Cecil did introduce the subject matter of the testing, and there appears to be two different stories. There's the Ken Hover version, and then there's the Jim Cornell version. And I think it's just two old geezers that can't remember anymore, so we don't. But my version is that we had some rust stains on the bottom of the soffit of in the garage, and we would go home and park in the garage, so we had to go through the garage. And I said, Ken, that's just rust from those dowel bars, and we're just picking it up off the bottom of the soffit. And he says, well, we could take a knife and something and scrape it off. And I said, well, pull out your pocket knife and scrape it off. Well, Yankee College professor, he doesn't have a knife. So I gave him mine, and we got in the back of pickup. I don't know where the story comes about getting on my shoulders, but he would have been too tall if he was on my shoulders. But sure enough, he scraped it off, and it wasn't corrosion. But it was, and we thought nothing about it till his deposition. Now this lawyer's got Ken in this headlock like this in the deposition, and he's going like this all day long, and then he comes to find out, he talks about rust or corrosion, and then Ken tells him about this, and lawyer leaps on him and says, unapproved, you can't go in there doing testing without having everybody there. He beat up Ken so bad, it was something fierce. And so I ended up, feeling pretty bad about that. And the fact the guy doesn't carry a knife, everybody carries, every Boy Scout carries a knife, but not Ken Hover. So I sent him a Limbeck Safety Award, and he still has we talked about his files, he still has the letter that transmits that knife to him. But that's how I met Ken Hover, was in that. And the relationship got so deep that I drove my family, my two kids, my wife and two kids, on a trip back east, and that's where we met Deb and the girls and spent the day. And I got the idea that I could get a PhD at Cornell, and maybe I could be just like Ken. And then I realized how much he worked and how much little I'm going to get paid. And so I went back to Texas and kept my job. Thank goodness I didn't have the truck loaded up with all kinds of house goods. So Ken's influence in ACI, and I'm going to focus on two of the committees that Ken's on. He and I are on several over the past 32 years. We've known each other 35 years, but the Hot Weather Committee, and this is an example of Ken's work and how he changes our industry. We're all familiar with the nomograph. This isn't the one that was in the guide. The one in the guide had a handwritten arrows going around it. We weren't as sophisticated as we are today, and so here's a paper that Ken wrote in 2006, and Ken's got this ability to have a little mini session with the committees, and in this case he had sat down with Hot Weather and gone through this stuff. But there's the original curve that Menzel worked up, and what the previous is what was in our book was the previous nomograph, but that was a little too sophisticated, but Menzel was able to change it to the NCR one. But what was missing was all the notes on how to measure the wind speed, where to measure the wind speed. And Ken's research, we'll see here in a minute, this is all extremely important. That wasn't even mentioned in our guide or in our spec. Ken also had the little bit tidbit that Menzel had actually didn't properly refer to the previous research properly, and actually stole the information. He didn't use those kinds of words. He's more polite than me, but and we ended up here. And every time you see the nomograph today, you also see the description. And Ken had done all that work, and so that we were able to enhance that there in the mid '80s, early '80s. The early '90s. But he was also setting the ground as he shared his research paper, and just look at the references. This paper's maybe 6 pages long, 7 pages long, yet he's got nearly 100 references. That shows you the detail that he goes to. And he's got these conclusions up here, which are kind of fuzzy and nice, but the real conclusion is up above, where he shows that the nomograph, we're plus or minus 25% on some of the actual evaporation rate. There's an overestimate by about 50%. I mean, that's the real thing that Ken brought to our table, was that technical knowledge. And with that, Ken led the committee so that we then got rid of the nomograph in our spec and our guide. We kept them in there, but we went to the pressure tables and a formula there, and the UNO information. Paul Uno out of New Zealand, we eventually incorporated his formula. ACI ZAP that's on our phones uses that formula to generate the alt, so we've totally stepped away from the nomograph. The lawyers still use the airport to get the information, but we don't know. We should be getting it in another way. So this is where Ken introduced me to ACI. I went to one of my first conventions, and I had applied as an associate to the curing committee, and I go to a subcommittee meeting, and of course my mentor Ken Hover, and we go into the meeting, and Frank's there. I remember the meeting. Frank Kozlinski's there, and Amy Pergalski's there. They're both here in the room, and it was the 4 of us. And Ken goes, "Okay, who's going to chair this subcommittee for writing the curing spec?" And Frank kind of looks down, and Amy looks up at the ceiling, and I'm just an associate, so I'm pretty happy and easy going. And we walk out in the hallway, and he never did get other committee members' commitment to be subcommittee chair. And we're walking down the hallway, and he just says, "Well, Mr. Chairman, what are you going to do with your spec?" And it took us 7 years to do that. And Cecil kind of talked a little bit back 30 years ago. We'd come to a convention. We'd have 2 bags. We'd be wearing our suit as we traveled, and we'd have a big bag that had another suit, because you wore your suit every day and you didn't want to wear the same suit every day. So you were toting all this stuff, and then this other bag was twice as big as your clothing bag, because it had all the paper you needed in order to attend, all the ballots, all the meeting minutes. I mean, it was a load. Later, we got smart enough to where we could just have a few and go to the speaker's ready room and Xerox. But as we were working through the spec, Ken was the leader working through the curing guide that was a total rewrite of that document. And it has something to do with the knife thing, where we nicknamed each other. He became Sir Knight, and I was the Squire. Well, a moment there, as I'm a senior. But I was a Squire. My first assignment when I got to the convention on Saturday was to scope out the closest Kinkos, what their hours were, what their rates were, and we'd show up at the first meeting on Sunday, and it might be a curing spec meeting, but we might be talking about the guide, because he's got something to talk about the guide, and we talk about the spec. And then that night we go to Kinko's, and we get on the computers, and we generate another version, and we print it on a different color paper. So Monday we'd have another meeting, and Tuesday and Monday night back to Kinko's. Tuesday another meeting, and then Tuesday night back to Kinko. And we kept doing that. If you come in to the committee meeting on Tuesday, you probably had the white version that we mailed to you, and we're already on past the green, and we're on the yellow version. And that was how we could keep going and generate these 2 documents. And it was you had to breathe pretty quick and keep up pretty quick with what was going on. And Cecil did throw Ken under the bus and confess to Debbie that that he never did get reimbursed for that. You could have had a new car. But that's how we were able to work that. And that's how we generated our friendship, as we'd work till 1 o'clock in the morning, typing the changes from that day and get the document through the system. Today, we've got laptops, we've got Zoom meetings, we've got other avenues. We come to the meeting with a gym bag and 1 gigabyte laptop under our arms and a cell phone that's got more brain power than we had in our big toe back in the 80s and 90s. So I discussed the first convention and how I got mentored into the subcommittee chair in the SPEC and the Kinko's. But a common theme today is Ken Hover, the mentor. And I'm an example and a product of Ken mentoring me, introducing me to specs that led to the hot weather spec, that led to the start of a former spec that got abandoned when we got access to 301 and the section 2 and getting involved with the 301 spec and the 117 spec and recently the drilled pier spec. My whole career at ACI is built around that first meeting and getting the leadership assignment of at that meeting to write a spec. And that's been my career here at ACI. And I really appreciate it. It's been a great help out in the field with my projects and stuff like that. But I like to feel I bring something at this stage. I actually understand mandatory language and can read it and write it, which took me, but Bryant Mather clearly cleaned my pile on that first edition of the spec because it was nowhere near his standard. But Ken, the mentor, as he mentored me, I had a great role model. I chased after this fella here, this Michael Fava fella, and worked on him and considered him one of the individuals I brought. And we've all got stories of other individuals. As Michael mentors other people, last night there were 2 other people next to me that I'm mentoring into the organization, and it's something we're all doing. And Ken is our example how to do it properly. And as we look at Ken's legacy, that's his legacy. Ken Hover's at the top. He's the first mentor. And as we look at that pyramid, and we know the size of that structure and the millions of blocks that are in there represent the individuals now and in the future that'll be the legacy of Ken Hover. And as we look at his document on the technical paper on the nomograph, and that teaches us at the committee level the value of good research. And again, another great example to us all, Ken, on how we should pursue excellence here at ACI and within our industry. Ken, your influence is just phenomenal. I got a rabbit trail. When a young man, you're hunting along the river, along the railroad tracks, and you see a rabbit run, you'll go off in some farmer's field chasing it, or hunting a rabbit trail. And I like to share the story of John Roberts. And Ken probably doesn't remember this one, but it was back in the 90s when Ken was chairman of the Curing Committee, and he and I were sitting there, and John Roberts had come to his first meeting, and John was in his 60s at that point in time, and he represented the lightweight industry. And he explained to Ken that he wanted to figure out the mechanism to somehow get lightweight fine aggregate incorporated into the mainstream of our industry. And Ken took, everybody else, I'm too busy to talk to you, but not Ken. Ken spends 30 minutes visiting with John, outlines John a program and a step that John could take on how to bring his knowledge and his need and join the Curing Committee and help influence them And then years later, we've got a internal curing guide in the curing committee championed by John Roberts as he followed the path that Ken Hover gave him on the first day. And that's an example of how Ken took out 15, 30 minutes of his time and changed our industry. And he's done that so many times. We're all shaking our heads yes. We know those examples. So Ken, it's a better world because of Ken Hover. And for me, professionally and personally, at the personal level, I'm a better man because I know Ken Hover. And it's been my privilege